So we're going to go straight to the Bolshevik Revolution, the October Revolution of 1917, okay? But first, there's actually two revolutions. There was the February Revolution of 1917, and then there was the October Revolution. This is the Russian Revolution. This is the one that most people think of when they think of the Russian Revolution, and that's the break, well, we already defined the revolution in other videos, but it's there was a 1905 Russian Revolution too. So there was a Russian Revolution in 1905, which didn't revolve anything really, and so this was like the second revolution that's finished. The czarist, the absolute, the emperor knocked out the emperor forever, right? So it was it was actually more of a rebellion, 1905 Russian Revolution, but there are other events that are called the Russian Revolution. That's all I'm pointing out right now. Okay, so the Russian Revolution is a collective term for a series of revolutions in Russia in 1917, so it's not actually even one event. It dismantled the czarist autocracy, led to the creation of the Russian SFSR. The emperor was forced to abdicate, and that's such a horrible word, but basically just gave up the throne. The abdication of Wilhelm of Germany in World War I was the great betrayal that Hitler talked about. He should have never have abdicated. How dare him abdicate? So here we see Nicholas II, he abdicates. They had tried to do some reforms with the first revolution in 1905, but they didn't do any of the reforms, and then they had no power, so they had to go along with the show. But more people are starving, people have bread, there's a demonstration with a priest, and then they killed a bunch of people, and that was just a bunch of bad moves. They're also fighting a war of imperialism, right? They're fighting a capitalist war of World War I in Europe for basically dominating who's the strongest empire. Archduke Franz Ferdinand, something to do with Austria. Hungary is murdered, and then Germany and Britain and America, United States and Russia. Why is all these people jumping into the First World War? Why was Woodrow Wilson? Why did he just? Oh man, he loved war, didn't he? Couldn't wait to get in there, and then he became a war to end all wars, right? He wanted to declare peace in our time, but Woodrow Wilson was a dick. He was a tyrannical. He changed everything. You want to talk about a revolution? Woodrow Wilson's electoral revolution, and then subsequent war, really just shredded any notion of freedom that Americans would see for a long time. But okay, there's the second revolution. You got the February Revolution, then you got the October Revolution. The emperor was forced to abdicate, and the old regime was replaced by a provisional government during the first revolution of February 1917. So February 1917, you have a provisional government who's operating, right? You also have the Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks, some other group where they're arguing, and the Bolsheviks jumped the gun. Okay, you had a provisional government that could have had elections, and Lenin could have been the elected president of a country that had term limits, so Stalin couldn't just take over, and ruin Marxism and communism and Leninism and Trotskyism, whatever those even mean, for decades. Stalin fucked up communism, okay, so fuck Stalin as a tyrannical, totalitarian piece of shit, and fuck Stalin as, a murderous, bloody dictator that ruined everything that Marx believed in, okay? So the Russian Revolution. The February Revolution, March 1917, was a revolution focused around Petrograd, now St. Petersburg. In the chaos, members of the Imperial Parliament, or Duma, assumed control of the country, forming the Russian Provisional Government. The army leadership felt they did not have the means to suppress the revolution, and Nicholas II, the last emperor of Russia, abdicated. So Nicholas II, right, his whole family's murdered. Romanovs, eventually several months after they abdicate. So they give up power. They should have got out of Dodge, but instead they stayed there. And then I think the Bolsheviks are the ones that actually killed them. They kidnap them, and then they murder not just Nicholas, but his wife and all of his children. Okay, in the chaos, the members of the Imperial Parliament, or Duma, assumed control of the country, forming the Russian Provisional Government. The army leadership felt like they did not have the means to suppress the revolution, and Nicholas II abdicated. The Soviets' workers' councils were led by more radical socialist factions, initially permitted the provisional government to rule, but insisted on a prerogative to influence the government and control various militias. The February Revolution took place in the context of heavy military setbacks during the First World World War, which left most of the Russian army in a state of mutiny. A period of dual war ensued, during which the provisional government held state power, while the national network of Soviets led by socialists had the allegiance of the lower classes and the political left. During this chaotic period, there were frequent mutinies, protests, and many strikes. When the provisional government chose to continue fighting the war with Germany, the Bolsheviks and other socialist factions campaigned for stopping the conflict. So, okay, the provisional government, that is bad. They continue fighting this war. And so they campaigned and tried to stop them from actually fighting in this World War I. Okay? And so you have the provisional government, which is vying for state power. Nation states, the theory says you have a monopoly of power when you hold on to the state. And then you had the socialists. You had the lower, these organizations of workers' councils who had a lot of poor people, and a lot of people believed in what they were talking about. So the Bolsheviks turned worker militias under the control into Red Guards, later the Red Army, over which they exerted substantial control. So the Leninists and the Bolsheviks were able to, they appealed to the Soviets at first, but I don't see how, with the collectivization of farms. They took land reform a different direction. So they're the Red Guards. The Red Army is the Lenin, the Bolsheviks, right? In the October Revolution, November in the Gregorian calendar, the Bolshevik Party, led by Vladimir Lenin and the Workers' Soviets, overthrew the provisional government in Petrograd. The Bolsheviks appointed themselves as leaders of various government ministries and seized control of the countryside, establishing the Cheka to quash dissent. To end Russia's participation in the First World War, the Bolshevik leaders signed the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk with Germany in March 1918. Civil war erupted between the Red Bolshevik and white anti-Bolshevik factions, which was to continue for several years, with the Bolsheviks ultimately victorious. This reminds me, since I'm comparing the Glorious Revolution to the Bolshevik Revolution, because it's bloodless, right? That's what they're saying. But there's fighting that happens for decades afterwards with the Jacobites, right? The Jacobites loved the King James and the House of Stuart, and they're Catholics too, so they wanted him to come back, right? For 40 years they fought for this tyrant. And then also you have, and the Russians are fighting for the Tsars. They fight for years, right, for the Tsars, or they was against the Bolsheviks. So they could have been Tsarists, but now you're getting the poor peasants with the Tsarists, and they're like, you can't, if you would have got democratic legitimacy, you wouldn't have been fighting military factions for years. Because if there was an election, well, there was an election. People had voted. People got a chance to say where they wanted, who they wanted to lead them and where they wanted it to go, their country, their state, or whatever. And therefore, it gives the illusion of legitimacy. But at least, without it, there's no legitimacy whatsoever. So the revolution paved the way for the creation of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics in 1922. While many notable historical events occurred in Moscow and Petrograd, there's also a visible movement in the cities throughout the state among national minorities throughout the empire and in rural areas where peasants took over and redistributed land. The October Revolution, because I'm trying to find how many people died, right? You had the Jacobites and the Irish and the Scots who, rebelled against William of Orange during England's glorious revolution. And again, this is a bad revolution. There's the change in leadership, which is through electoral revolution, and then there's constitutional revolutions, and then there's bloody, bad coup d'etat or war and battle-like revolutions, which coup d'etat seems almost more, an assassination seems more humane than protracted war. Having pits of men fight against other, groups of men, and just have everybody dying in the battlefield for some, corrupt leaders, stupid wishes, versus just, just taking out the leader. There, the state is gone. Okay, that person represented the state. Now he's gone. So, that's Emma Goldman. She had supported, the coup d'etats, assassinations. And again, I'd asked the question about the Lincoln Revolution versus the Andrew Johnson Revolution. Lincoln had a war protracted. He got a lot of changes and did a lot of things. The Emancipation Proclamation basically set into force irreversible, things that was going to change. and war upon the battlefields was definitely, the federal government taking power over the states. There's a lot of significant changes that happened because of the Civil War, because of Lincoln's um, electoral revolution, where he got power and then became a war president, squashing his own people, the rebellion, right, of his own union. And then you have Andrew Johnson, who became his vice president, and then after he had got assassinated, Abraham Lincoln, Johnson takes power and undoes, all of Lincoln's sort of claims to fame and what he had done. He set up with the radical Republicans. They had this big bloody conflict. They legalized, or they made it illegal to have slaves. They had the Freedmen's Bureau. We had the democratic processes that was working. Schools were being established for not just black folks, but white folks, which had never been happening before. Never had happened. There was land reform. There was a lot of really positive things that was going to come out of Lincoln's revolution. But Andrew Johnson was the anti-revolution. He was sort of the, he was the I don't know, what's that pill you take that gives you diarrhea? He was that guy. He was that pill. But that's sad and unfortunate, but that's just how it goes. So the October Revolution, also known as the Great October Socialist Revolution, Red October, the October Rising, or the Bolshevik Revolution, was a seizure of state power instrumental in the larger Russian Revolution of 1917. It took place with an armed insurrection in Petrograd, St. Petersburg, traditionally dated October 25th, 1917, by the Julian or Old Style calendar, which corresponds to November 7th, 1917, in the Gregorian or New Style calendar. So this so-called October Revolution was really a November Revolution, right? The Red October Revolution was really a Gray November Revolution. So who knows what? Nobody can believe anything these people say. But it's the Bolshevik. It's definitely the Red Bolshevik Revolution. Okay, so it's the second revolution of. Okay, so it followed and capitalized on the February Revolution of the same year, which overthrew the Tsarist autocracy, established a provisional government composed predominantly of former nobles and aristocrats. During this time, urban workers began organizing the councils. Soviet is the Russian word for councils, wherein revolutionaries criticized the provisional government and its actions. The October Revolution in Petrograd overthrew the provisional government and gave power to the local Soviets dominated by the majority Bolshevik faction of the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party. This immediately initiated the establishment of the Russian Socialist Federative Soviet Republic, the world's first self-proclaimed socialist state. As the revolution was not universally recognized outside of Petrograd, there following the struggles of the Russian Civil War, 1917 to 1922, so for 5 years, a bloody civil war, and then the creation of the Soviet Union in 1922. The revolution was led by Bolsheviks who used their influence in the Petrograd Soviet to organize the armed forces. Bolshevik Red Guards forces under the Military Revolutionary Committee began to take over government buildings on October 24th, 1917. The following day, the Winter Palace, the seat of the provisional government located in St. Petersburg, Petrograd, then the capital of Russia, was captured. Okay, so that's the revolution. It was the capture of the Winter Palace. So William of Orange, he took the English palace, whatever that was, the house. Once King James ran away. So not only does it takes the removal of the dictator to go to a different spot. It takes the symbolic place of the people recognized in the house, right? So get people out of the government buildings and then put your people inside those buildings. In truth, little happened on October 24th, the first day of the Russian Revolution. The main event was that Lenin made his way across town to the Smolny Institute disguised as a drunk with a toothache. Late that evening, Bolshevik troops made their way to pre-assigned positions and systematically occupied crucial points in the capital. So he was a drunk with a toothache. Oh, I'm drunk with a toothache. Oh, get out of here, you're drunk with a toothache. So then later on, the Bolsheviks made their way to pre-assigned positions and systematically occupied crucial points in the capital, including the main telephone and telegraph offices, banks, railroad stations, post offices, and most major bridges. Not a single shot was fired, as the junkers assigned to guard these sites either fled or were disarmed without incident. Even the headquarters of the general staff, the army headquarters, was taken without resistance. So the headquarters of the army. No resistance. The Bolshevik troops made their way to the preassigned positions, systematically occupied crucial points in the capital, including main telephone and telegraph offices, banks, railroad stations, post offices, and major bridges. So they had lots of troops, lots of people. That was dispatched on October 24th. Okay? So whereas the Dutch came over and took over England, and the English just said, to hell with it. That's the Glorious Revolution, right? When a foreign country came in and took over England, that's the Glorious Revolution. It was bloody, bloodless. Until the Irish and the Scots were like, hey, we're not going to listen to this stupid-ass Protestants. We're, Catholics. Not a single shot was fired on October 24th. With all these people, they took over banks, railroads, and everything else. So basically, a surprise. That's how Russia did it with the Czech Republic. Just surprise. They just roll into the capital of the Czechoslovakia at the time was something, I don't know. I'm Bohemian and I don't even know the capital of the Czech Republic. But I know more than my culture of ignorant cousins. So that gives me some pride. So the siege of the Winter Palace. Okay, so they was able to take over all these buildings and positions, but not the Winter Palace itself. So the morning of October 25th, the Winter Palace was the only government building that had not yet been taken over. At 9 a.m., Kerensky, who's the leader of the provisional government, sped out of the city in a car commandeered from the U.S. Embassy. So he took a car. I don't know if that shows support for the provisional government, but he was using an American car, right? Supplied by the Americans. The other ministers remained in the palace, hoping that Kerensky would return with loyal soldiers from the front. Meanwhile, Bolshevik forces brought a warship, the cruiser Aurora, up the Neva River. Wow, they even had a warship. Took up a position near the palace. Other Bolshevik forces occupied the fortress of Peter and Paul on the opposite bank of the river from the palace. By that afternoon, the palace was completely surrounded and defended only by the Junker guards inside. The provisional government ministers hid in a small dining room on the second floor, awaiting Kerensky's return. So they're hiding in a small dining room on the second floor. The Bolsheviks spent the entire afternoon and most of the evening attempting to take control of the Winter Palace and arrest the ministers within it. Although the palace was defended weakly by the Junker cadets, most of the Bolshevik soldiers were unwilling to fire on fellow Russians or on the buildings of the Russian capital. Instead, small groups broke through the palace windows and negotiated with the Junkers, eventually convincing many of them to give up, although some accounts claim that a few shots were fired. Little or no violence ensued. The ministers were finally arrested shortly after 2 a.m. on October 26th, escorted to prison cells in the Peter and Paul fortress. Kerensky never returned and eventually escaped abroad, living out his life first in continental Europe and then as a history professor in the United States. Wow. Okay. So that's the revolution. That's how the revolution. Basically, he just had lots of people man their post. Everybody got into the thing and just walked into the building and said, "This is ours." Convinced the people in the middle, you've lost. Your guy Kerensky took off. What else are you going to do? You're going to sit there and defend. And then they sent him to prison, which was unfortunate actually, because they didn't have to do that, but I guess it just seemed like an easy thing to do. Nobody was in power. They was having like a little bit of power, still negotiating. Stop with the negotiations. Take power. And initiate your reforms. So that's sort of the Bolsheviks' perspective, but because of that, you had the Civil War that happened for many years, just like with the Jacobites. So you can't have a coup d'état or revolutions. Really, they fail. It almost seems like they're justifications for just a war with some of the revolutions. So, and unfortunately, I don't know why we look at revolutions with fondness, because they were bloody conflicts where lots of people died. There's no glory or honor in lots of people dying. But these were, in terms of bloody conflicts, these were the bloodless, the less bloody of the, coup d'état. So the Bolshevik Revolution seemed like there's basically nobody that died. Even though there's a few reports that some shots were fired. But that's it. Compared to the Glorious Revolution where you had, but then you had the Civil War. So the actual takeover itself, and then the subsequent aftermath. So the subsequent aftermath, there was plenty of people to die in the Glorious Revolution and in the Bolshevik Revolution. But in the actual takeover of William of Orange coming over and James just walking away, or with the abdication of Nicholas II, and the whole Bolshevik takeover, right? The whole October Revolution, or the the Bolshevik Red Revolution, the Second Revolution of 1917, the Russian Revolution, was bloodless. So nobody had died. Next 5 years you're going to have a civil war where lots of people die. But the actual revolution itself, the actual takeover of power, was done efficiently, done quickly, and bloodless. Nobody had died, which is remarkable. So basically, it seems like, yeah, like I said already, my analysis of the Russians, they had been talking about change and reform, but nobody was taking the reins of power. So they saw a weak provisional government, and they said, "To hell with it. We got enough troops and military people to take it over ourselves." So that's what they did. And then when they should have established elections, they should have had elections. I don't know why they weren't thinking elections then. Like, elections, to vote. That would eventually, you would, look at Bolivia. We're voting in socialists. So socialists have political, prowess. They can get in through electoral revolutions. You didn't have to be a bloody revolutionary. Lenin, what were you thinking, man?